Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
JustCom Music Ministry, your daily dose of inspiration. Follow JustCom PH on Spotify and JustCom Music on YouTube. We are also on iTunes and Deezer.
If it's entertainment you crave, catch us on New Wave. Surfing through the latest on our shores. New Wave. Every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. New Wave. See you there.
Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM. Rejoice, refresh, renew, and reflect. Join us for an hour of music that uplifts the soul. Listen to your favorite Jesuit music ministry artists. This is JMM Radio. JMM Radio. Get your day's dose of inspirational music. Tune in to JMM Radio every Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. Only here on Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM. Radyo Katipunan. News, insights, inspiration. Radyo Katipunan. Down from the hill and down to the world. Radyo Katipunan, the voice of the Blue Eagle.
Feeling blue? Ever thought of looking into the bright side of things? Let us help you out. Join our light, engaging, and inspiring conversations with our Chaplains on Air. Hosted by Father Junji Bargayo and Father Henry Ponce of the Society of Jesus. Chaplains on Air. The chaplains are now in. Here on Chaplains on Air. Thursdays at 6 p.m. only on Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM.
You're listening to the voice of the Blue Eagle.
You know what it is?
Voice of the Blue
Ateneo
Eagle.
Campus Radio.
Radyo Katipunan, 87.9.
Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, radyo, Katipunan. Voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay Atenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng buwela. Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero, sugod, todo sa kayod, tulong at tulong. Lipat na Blue Eagle, galing giting nagigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan, radyo, 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 Katipunan, radyo, Katipunan.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede?
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede.
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
Tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Nakikinig kayo ngayon sa Baka Naman Pwede, isang programa ng Institute of Philippine Culture o IPC at ng Radyo Katipunan na naglalayong pagnilayan ang mga napapanahong issue gamit ang lente ng agham panlipunan o social sciences. Nais din natin mapagkwentuhan ang mga bagay na baka naman pwede nating tingnan muli, pag-ukulan ng pansin at aksyonan. Ako si Trixie Beato ng Department of Political Science at ng Institute of Philippine Culture at ako ang inyong magiging host sa hapong ito. Noong nakaraang episode, nakasama natin ang mga bumubuo ng Baka Naman Pwede para buksan ang panibagong season ng BNP at pagkwentuhan ang mga paksang tinalakay sa nakaraang episodes. Nagsimula ang kwentuhan sa pagbabalik tanaw sa pinagmula ng IPC at iba't ibang engagements nito sa mga nakalipas na taon, gaya ng research, capacity at competence building programs, community partnerships, at knowledge dissemination activities kung saan nakapaloob ang Baka Naman Pwede. Naibahagi ang naging tungkulin ng BNP bilang alternatibong paraan ng pagpapalaganap ng research findings sa madla. Ikinwento namin ang pinagmulan ng BNP bilang offshoot ng mga webinars na ino-organize ng IPC, lalo na noong kasagsagan ng pandemya, kung saan naging convener ang programa ng iba't ibang grupo para talakayin ang mga napapanahong issue sa paraang mas conversational. Dagdag rito, naging papel ng BNP ang bigyang pagpansin ang mga isyung nakaligtaan dahil sa pagtutok ng bansa sa COVID-19. Panghuli, ipinunto ng team ang pangangailangan na maitawid sa pangkaraniwang Pilipino ang resulta ng mga pananaliksik sa pag-asang mas mapalawig nito ang mga pag-uusap-usap tungkol sa mga isyung panlipunan. Para sa mga gustong balikan ang mga nakaraang episodes ng Baka Naman Pwede, mangyari lamang na bisitahin ang Facebook page ng Institute of Philippine Culture at makakasama natin si Luz Rimban ng Asian Center for Journalism para pag-usapan ang papel ng mass media sa pagbuo at pagpapaunlad ng mga democratic spaces sa lipunan. Sa mga manonood natin sa Facebook, pwede kayong sumali sa aming kwentuhan. Mangyari lamang na i-type ang inyong mga komento at katanungan sa comment section at babasahin namin ang mga ito sa ating Q&A portion mamaya. Ngayon, hayaan niyo po akong ipakilala sa inyo ang ating bisita. Si Ma'am Luz Rimban, ang Executive Director ng Asian Center for Journalism ng Ateneo de Manila University. Siya ay nagtuturo ng journalism sa pamantasan ng Ateneo mula pa noong 2003. Kasama ang iba pang mga veteranong Filipino journalist, itinatag niya ang Verifiles noong 2008, isang independent media organization na nagsusulong ng katotohanan sa pamamagitan ng mga in-depth reports at komentaryo tungkol sa iba't ibang issue. Sa ating mga tagapakinig at manonood, bigyan natin ng masigabong virtual na palakpakan or virtual round of applause si Ma'am Luz Rimban. So welcome back po sa Baka Naman Pwede.
Hi, good afternoon, Trixie. Pinagagala kong makasama kayo ulit dito.
Yes. Maraming salamat po sa pagpapaunlak sa aming imbitasyon. So, ngayong hapon, katulad ng nabanggit ko po kanina, ang episode na ito ay bahagi ng ating paggunita sa anibersaryo ng People Power Revolution ng 1986, of which sa Sabado na ang simula yung actual anniversary sa February 25. So, siguro bilang panimula, baka naman pwede niyo po kaming kwentuhan, Ma'am Luz. Ano po yung mga pinagkakaabalahan niyo these days? What keeps you busy these days?
We're at the Asian Center for Journalism, we're running a program called the Diploma in Visual Journalism. So yung Asian Center for Journalism ay abala sa tinatawag na continuing education of practicing journalists. So may diploma program kami at saka may mga workshops kung saan kasama namin ng mga iba't ibang journalists mula sa iba't ibang platform. Pinag-uusapan namin ang mga issue sa journalism ngayon.
I see. So, well, I'm sure kasama na rin doon syempre yung kahalagahan ng press freedom at yung state media today. And I think very tied po, syempre, yung inyong mga experiences at yung ginagawa ng Asian Center for Journalism, itong topic natin ngayon, which is definitely the People Power Revolution. And well, para po sa ating mga manonood, parte po ng naging context o konteksto ng pagpili namin ng episode ngayon ay gusto namin sanang tanungin kung ano nga ba yung naging papel ng media sa pagpapakalat ng impormasyon, especially during the EDSA revolution, and yung kahalagahan ng media sa ating demokrasya in general. So, alam kong medyo na pahapyawan na po natin to via email, pero kayo po, well, anong taon na po kayo nung na-declare yung martial law and maybe yung EDSA? Ilang taon na po kayo? If you
Alam mo,
don't mind me asking.
it's okay. I was just 10 years old nung dineclare yung martial law. And then, I wrote about this in an article for the Philippine Star. When martial law was declared, I think everyone experienced it. Yung biglang naging silent yung TV, mga radyo, the airwaves went silent. In our particular experience, in my experience, we were living somewhere south of Manila. And then suddenly, out of the blue, there was this helicopter that descended on our village. Apparently, a military helicopter to fetch one of the colonels who was a resident of the village. And that was when we decided, or we realized that something was afoot. Parang may nangyayari. Tapos walang mga TV at saka radio for some days. And I was very young at that time, and it was only in my college days that I realized what had happened. I read about it. And I was also reading the newspapers because at that time, I was living with my grandmother, and they always had a newspaper at home. So it's a ritual, I guess, among the older Filipinos. When you have your breakfast, nagbabasa ka ng dyaryo, nagkakape ka, di ba? Parang maybe your lola, your parents, or your lolo and lola. Naalala siguro nila yung pag nag-almusal ka, kasama mo yung dyaryo, no? Nagbabasa ka ng dyaryo. So may habit na ganun yung grandmother ko. And that also started my love for the newspaper, for writing, for journalism.
Yeah, so well, yun nga po. I mean, I can't imagine how that would feel like, no, at an early age. Parang yun, bigla na lang nag-black yung nag-screens, and siguro for a child as young as you, biglang nag-change talaga din yung mga routine ng grandparents.
Yeah.
So, well, next question ko po, at least maybe before we get to discussing the role of media during the EDSA revolution, under martial law, what was the state of what was the state of journalism like? So, na-mention yung nga po na biglang nag-blacking screen. So, paano po yung naging kalabasan ng mga newspapers? What was it like po?
I mentioned to you that I wrote an article for the University of the Philippines Department of History. They produced a book called The Marcos Years, and I talked to the elders of the profession. Alam mo, it was nung pagkahuli sa that night, actually the early morning of September 23, hinuli yung mga tao, the evening of September 22, 23. Although nakalagay sa papel September 21 ang declaration ng martial law. Pero September 23 nagkahulihan. So when Marcos declared martial law, he immediately picked up, kinulong niya talaga lahat ng mga opposition leaders, journalists, columnists, and he threw everyone in jail, including the members of the Constitutional Convention. So at that time, there was a Constitutional Convention, and they were discussing amendments to the Constitution. When Marcos declared martial law, kinulong niya lahat yan. Kinulong niya lahat talaga, as in journalists, student leaders, ganyan. And Marcos also shut down all the newspapers and broadcast stations. So there are a lot of stories from the veterans who say, some of them wanted to go to work, but the soldiers were guarding the newspapers and they couldn't get in. So yun yung kalagayan. Talagang Marcos clamped down. Sinara niya talaga. And it was, I guess, a shock kasi you don't have the newspapers. But um, the funny thing is, Filipinos got used to it. But there's this book called The Conjugal Dictatorship, where the author, Primitivo Mijares, who was a former journalist himself, and he became the executive secretary of Ferdinand Marcos. And sinulat niya, I'll quote, "The night the dark shadows of totalitarianism swallowed the Philippines on September 22, 1972, the intellectual lights went out, along with all other inalienable rights of the Filipino people." So yung may ibig sabihin yung intellectual lights went out, yung I think the thinking class, the political influencers of our time, of that time, they all disappeared. So can you imagine? I guess you could say that we were lost. The Filipino people were lost. You don't have any more independent news coming to you. Marcos and his cronies took over the newspapers. 3 were allowed to operate: Daily Express, Manila Bulletin, and Times Journal. Manila Bulletin was owned by a friend of Marcos, si Hans Menzi, while the 2 others were owned by Cocoy Romualdez, the brother of the First Lady. And alam mo ang kwento nila ng mga matatanda sa industriya, during those times, pagpapasok yung mga journalists, may military censors sila right in the newsroom. May kasama silang military censors or editors. Tinitingnan yung mga sinusulat nila at ina-approve or disapprove. So kailangan no bad news na lumalabas, walang masamang balita tungkol sa gobyerno and all that. So yun yung nangyari. Yun yung nangyari sa ating media.
Wow, I didn't know about yung military censors.
Yes, di ba? We didn't know about that. It's only now as the elders are talking about it that we realize, ay, ganun pala kalala.
Yeah.
Di ba? Hindi mo, akala mo lang yung sinesensor. Hindi, may nakaupo na military doon sa loob ng newsroom. And these things were not properly I guess they were documented somehow. But having a single narrative where everyone being made aware of what happened, yan yung medyo hindi nangyari, I think. Yung ano ba yung talagang nangyari doon sa ano ba talaga yung nangyari doon sa martial law?
So what was yung na-mention niyo po na parang at this time, di ba? Well, na-mention niyo po yung pagkakaroon ng parang state-sponsored through the military censors and literal physical parang presence ng censors. Pero what was yung reaction what was the reaction of the people then to the control of the media? So na-mention niyo po na parang nasanay rin po yung mga Filipinos. I mean, how did that parang play out? In your research, in your experience, right?
So, I interviewed in the book. I write about my interview with George Season. George Season was a society columnist, but he was also arrested. Walang rhyme or reason yung mga arrests. But if you examine the case of each one, makikita mo . I was able to talk to George Season, who was a society columnist. And yung kasalanan niya was that he wrote a lot of things about Imelda Marcos and Dovie Beams, who was the kalaguyo of then President Ferdinand Marcos. She was an American actress. And then, so George was himself arrested. And he was telling me na yung kinasasama ng loob nila is that hindi pumalag yung mga Pinoy dun sa martial law. Maybe it's because, I don't know, maybe it's because they didn't know what was happening, or maybe they just wanted to mind their own business, or they just wanted peace and quiet. Ewan natin, no? Or maybe they were looking for guidance from columnists, political leaders, but they could not find any because they were all in jail. So, sabi ni George, yan yung tampo daw nila sa Filipino people. Kasi parang tinanggap lang yung martial law. And I was interviewing a former executive secretary of Marcos, and he was saying, people didn't resist martial law, people just accepted the situation. But ako naman, I wouldn't consider it a bad. I mean, a bad thing. I mean, let's accept it that people didn't know what's going on. With the loss of the media, you also lost your connection with the community. So parang hindi mo talaga alam ang gagawin. Yun.
Well, that's a lot din po to think about, no? Yung this
Yeah.
idea nga of, well, I mean, yung part of the daily life then. Although, of course, syempre, this is parang mas ibang topic din naman po yung,
Yes.
pero definitely, part din siya of the context of parang what set up parang EDSA. So let's move a little bit towards, well, towards EDSA. Parang how did it come to a head? So parang this was the life, diba, that people were getting used to, and parang yung na-mention nga po na there were media practitioners who were kind of pushing back, pero parang it seemed like it wasn't parang getting anywhere, parang mas nasasanay yun na yung mga tao. So how did it come to a head, or what were siguro mga crucial points that you noticed?
When you're going to talk about EDSA and the media, you really have to backtrack. Kasi kasi the media as we know it, as the post EDSA media as we know it, didn't just come about, instantly. So you have to go back to the 1970s, years of martial law. People also hungered for information. And so we had what we call the mosquito press. So these are the small newspapers that were put up by courageous individuals. So one of them is We Forum. It was published by Joe Burgos, and they published the news that could not come out in the Marcos papers, in the Marcos media. Let's call it the Marcos media during those times. So among the stories that came out was an article by a retired colonel writing from the US that Marcos was not really a war hero. Kasi yun yung isang PR press release ni na Marcos na he was a war hero, well decorated, etc. Hindi pala totoo. It was fake. So as these stories came out, I guess people realized that, teka, what else is not true? Diba? So parang, ano pa yung hindi natin alam? I guess there was this hunger for information that needed to be filled. And so there were also other people who put up newspapers risking their lives and their resources for this. After We Forum, nagkaroon ng Pahayagang Malaya, and then there was Mr. and Miss, and then on the eve of the EDSA revolution, lumabas na yung Inquirer, and I think the Philippine Star. Kasi medyo, and remember also in 1983, there was Ninoy Aquino was assassinated, and people were really, were already, unsettled with the dictatorship. No, parang, what is happening? Tatanong yung mga tao. There was a hunger for information. So there was a need for the alternative press.
Yeah, and I think thank you po for highlighting that. Na parang yun, as you said, talagang it's very difficult to get to parang media's role in EDSA and post-EDSA without highlighting that. Parang at a certain point, it did come to a head na maybe people were starting to ask questions of, the information that they were being presented with, if it was true or what else was they were hiding.
At saka alam mo, Trixie, hindi lang kasi yung political, there were also a lot of economic happenings. So people wanted to know what was going on, like the dollar suddenly, the peso suddenly devalued against the dollar. There was the flight of economic capital. So humihirap yung buhay ng mga tao, no? Inflation was going up. So people wanted answers. People wanted to know what's going on. Katulad din natin ngayon, no? when things are when things are happening, we want to know what's going on, what's in the background that we don't know.
Yeah, that's true. I think, well, parang tying din to today, 'di ba? Parang if it does come to that point where you ask, parang what are they keeping from us, or let's say what's missing in this parang big picture. So, you mentioned po na towards especially in the 1980s, 1970s and 80s, sumalabas na po yung mga mosquito papers, parang starting out with a few parang courageous journalists, alternative media that were publishing these stories. Tapos eventually, after Ninoy Aquino was, excuse me, after Ninoy Aquino was um, assassinated, lumabas na yung mga bigger papers. So how did that come to a head, during the EDSA revolution itself, especially since, 'di ba, EDSA was described as, well, of course it's not something that happened really spontaneously, 'di ba? It came as a product of parang organization and parang years of parang underground movements. So where did the media figure in all of that?
What media continued to report, so the reality that we have to face is that there was a pro-Marcos propaganda media that really reported on the Marcoses, on the government, on happenings from the point of view of the government. But there was also a growing discontent. You had probably young journalists who were also writing and asking questions. In the transition from the 60s to the 70s, nagkaroon, for example, ng journalism school sa UP, sa University of the Philippines. And UP Journ produced a lot of the journalists who were, asking questions and writing stories. So there was another generation that was rising. So that was how, I think that was how it happened, no? Alam mo, kung isipin ko, I was siguro part of that later generation, no? Nag-college ako during the Marcos years. When I joined the profession, I realized, there's a gap. May lost generation, may gap ng mga elders na medyo, if you talk to them, they're very pro government. So parang where were the independent journalists of before? And then you realize na, nga, wala pala, di ba? Or maybe meron, pero some of them worked in the newspapers and, quietly, silently, they were there. By the way, for me, one of the most significant events as far as the media is concerned is the rise of the women writers in media. So I think just before the Ninoy Aquino assassination and all the way in the 1980s, may lumabas na grupo ng mga matatapang talaga na women writers. Tapos they were writing on things that could not be written in the Marcos paper. So you had, one of them was Ceres Doyo. She was writing about Makliing Dulag and how Makliing Dulag was killed resisting the Chico Dam in Kalinga, Apayao. And then you also had other writers talking about repression, no, in Metro Manila. So nagkaroon ng, for me, they were my idols, eh. Parang hangang-hanga ako sa kanila, no. You also had Letty Jimenez Magsanok, who was the editor of Panorama magazine. So she had her own run-ins with the government. Tapos nakakabilib sila kasi they wrote at risk, no? They risked their lives and their reputations and their jobs just to be able to write those things. And makikita mo doon talagang yung role ng women sa media at that time. Kasi sila talaga yung sila nagsusulat. And because of their courage, I think it encouraged other people to come out and write.
Oh, salamat po, Ma'am Luz. Well, yun nga, parang these are yung unsaid stories talaga, or yung as you mentioned, parang wala nga talagang siguro grand parang narrative that parang highlights this. So baka nga po it's a great opportunity for you to have shared that, especially, do you touch about this in the book chapter that you wrote as well po, or?
Yeah, I touched on the early Marcos years, right after Marcos. Kasi balik ulit tayo, backtrack ulit tayo. Noong 1972 kasi, nung sinara ni Marcos yung mga dyaryo, maraming nawalan ng trabaho na journalists. at saka ng media workers. According to Primitivo Mijares, as many as 50,000 lost their jobs. So, itignan mo yung parallel dun sa shutdown ng ABS-CBN noong 2022, noong 2020, di ba? 11,000 lost their jobs. Much more than that, lost their jobs in 1972 kasi maraming iba pang nasara na newspapers. Maliliit na radyo, television all over the country, they were all closed down. And then nawala ng trabaho yung mga journalists. So I think that's a big lesson, you know. If you want to, parang alam ng mga diktador kung paano mo iko-control yung media. Tanggalan mo lang sila ng platform, tanggalan mo sila ng dyaryo, ng radyo, television. Hindi na sila makakapagsulat. So parang na-perfect nila yun. Parang na-perfect nila yun yung ganong klaseng pagkilos laban sa media. So in 1972, maraming some went into the academe. They were teaching. So some of the best minds talagang were gone. Some of the best pens were gone and had to resort to all sorts of things. They had to live it. They had to survive. So yun yung ginawa nila.
Does this factor in po to what you were saying na parang may lost generation nga of parang yun nga, mentors or at least parang independent voices?
Yes. Yeah, it does. I mean, because the best of the best, let's say they were in their late 20s or they were in their 20s in 1972. By the time EDSA came along, that was 14 years later, they were already in their 40s. They were already tired of fighting. They were in a different profession. Those who stayed, meron pa rin. May mga mahuhusay. Pero hindi siya isang grupo. It's maybe isolated, no? Isolated people. Kasi up to 1986, of course, Marcos was in power, and all those years, sila pa rin yung may control sa media. Sa mainstream media. In fact, yung sinasabi ko sa yung We Forum at saka yung Pahayagang Malaya, parang impression ko nun, mayat-maya kinukulong sila ni Marcos. I-raid yung kanilang opisina, ikukulong sila, kukunin sila, ikukulong. And then mag-open na naman sila and they'll write the same things. So yun.
So definitely we pay homage talaga sa mga the independent and brave.
Definitely. Yes.
And I think, na-mention niyo po pala, naisip ko lang po. So na-mention niyo po na you went to college then towards the latter half of the Marcos years, right? So how did they teach? Did you go to school for journalism? So how did they teach journalism to young college students? Parang what was the framing, if you don't mind me asking?
You know, that's a good question. My mother didn't want me to go into journalism kasi it was the martial law year. So I had to detour to find another course before I ended up in journalism eventually. What they were, we didn't have the restrictions that you think we had in school, no? Kasi in school we had, one of my teachers was Louis Beltran. Luis Beltran was incarcerated by Marcos. He spent months or years in prison, and through him we learned independent writing. What you need to look for the stories wherever they are. So I remember that I had him for 3 classes at UP, no? I forget the exact classes, but one of them was investigative reporting, one of them was interpretive reporting, and you imbibe I imbibed a lot of things from him. And I also realized that he had a history, no? He was also at that time the Dean of Student Affairs of the UP, if I remember right. So may mga kwento-kwento siya sa amin, and I think it rubbed off on us. So although hindi kami you don't see independent reporting except for the mosquito press outside, in school we were taught na sige, you pursue those kinds of stories. You have to get, if you want to focus on a story, if you want to find out everything about the story, you have to go the extra mile. Kailangan hanapin mo talaga yung storya. So that sort of stayed with me. And of course, that was the University of the Philippines. It was where in UP, Marcos shut down the UP Student Council for many years. And then in 1981, he allowed it to be, he allowed the restoration of the University Student Council. And with that, 1981 ba o 1980? And with that, student activism also. Siguro akala ni Marcos, siguro itong mga to nakalimutan na nila yung martial law. Itong mga to wala na silang alam sa martial law. Siguro yun ang nasa isip niya. In the same manner that we think of your generation as, hindi, wala nang alam yung mga yan tungkol sa martial law. Wala nang. But, we pass the knowledge on from generation to generation in many ways. It can be through our writing, it can be through our teaching. So, may mga nakakausap kaming mga oldies who, went to prison, who were so idealistic at that time and still are idealistic. So, yun.
Salamat po for that. So, punta po naman po tayo dun sa EDSA po mismo. So, for the EDSA, at least yung, unfortunately, parang syempre, I also have to rely on kwento here. Yung kwento po sa akin nung at least some of the people that I know during that were able to go who were college students at the time. Pumunta daw po sila sa EDSA. Yung their only means of communicating with each other was through radio. So may nagkwento sa akin na pumunta daw siya to EDSA with yung parang boombox. Yung malaking parang boombox level. Parang just to hear updates on the news through radio. So what was that like for, journalists or perhaps students of journalism? Parang yung, during the parang EDSA revolution mismo, how did that play out?
I was also there, no. Kasi this is how the media played a role, direct role, no. We all know that February 20 EDSA started with Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos breaking away from the Marcos government and then holding themselves up in Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo. And of course, at that time, things were coming to a head. Katatapos lang ng snap election. People thought na talagang pandaraya yon. Marcos declared himself the winner, etc. So pandaraya talaga yon. And I think emotions were high. Cory Aquino was calling for a boycott of companies that supported the Marcoses and all that. Patuloy yung mga rallies. And then biglang nag-break away si Enrile at saka si Ramos. So, syempre, everyone was, oops, what's happening? And then at midnight, I thought in the evening of February 22, Cardinal Sin goes on the air in Radio Veritas. And I think a lot of people were listening, apparently, because he issued the call to everyone to go to EDSA and to protect Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos from the forces of Marcos. And people responded. People responded in the millions. So magtataka ka talagang, maybe word of mouth. People were saying, you listen to Radio Veritas because that's a reliable radio station. And then sometimes, I think, siguro some of them would say, people from this and this, please proceed to this and this place. You'll see each other, etc.
Yeah.
I remember I ran into my parents there. We didn't talk. We did not talk. We did not say anything. I did not contact them. And we just ran into each other at EDSA. So, yun. Kanya-kanya eh. Parang it was not it was not really an organized thing. But eventually, of course, as the EDSA days rolled on, medyo nagkakaroon na ng ayos. But at first, it was an unorganized response to the call of Cardinal Sin.
I see. So the importance nga po talaga of the radio.
Radio, yeah. So hindi naman internet noon na 'di ba? Wala pa talagang internet. And if you want to listen to radio, talaga magdadala ka ng portable transistor radio. 'Di ba? Yung may baterya. Nakakita ka na ba noon?
Actually, parang hindi pa po ata. Pero, pero meron kami yung that big, parang
The
boombox
boombox,
type na debateria. What about, and then during the process of the pagpunta sa EDSA, tapos media was continuing to report na then. How was it like?
Of course, andyan na yung Inquirer, di ba? Andyan na yung... So, the Inquirer was already reporting what was really happening. I don't remember anymore what the mainstream media... I guess, you cannot escape reporting it. I mean, you cannot but not report about it, di ba? So, eventually, the pro-democracy forces took over Channel 4. And then Inquirer, people were so happy with the Inquirer. Because they were really covering the whole, the whole EDSA uprising. And also, of course, the foreign press. So yun.
I see. So, were there at least during EDSA itself, would you say that that syempre it presented a lot of opportunities not to continue to go back to reporting what was actually happening and kind of feed that parang hunger for information. So, were there any challenges po kaya at least during EDSA itself?
Are you talking about the years immediately after EDSA or during EDSA?
During EDSA po itself.
Of course, the Philippines became the center of attention, no, international and local attention. So parang it was an opportunity to report, what was happening. Pero that the EDSA itself triggered, opened up democratic space. So in the immediate aftermath of EDSA, ang daming nagsipag-usbong na newspapers. There were so many newspapers, and I think TV stations, local cable stations. Ang dami talaga. Because there was so much to write about. So ganito yung nangyari. Kasi repressed yung mga Pinoy, di ba? Repressed sa information. All those years, people wanted to know what was going on, how bad was corruption and all that. So, di ba, alam mo naman to, di ba, nung EDSA, February 25, Filipinos stormed Malacanang, di ba? They went into Malacanang and they climbed the walls, went into the rooms, and they found so many things.
Yeah.
They found, I think they found documents, they found the shoes. Talagang nilusob ng mga tao. Kasi, gusto natin malaman, ano ba tong pinaggagawa ng mga Marcos? And so that sort of opened, that sort of opened the floodgates, telling the Filipino this is exactly what happened to the Marcoses. They amassed so much money during their time in power. Marami silang ari-arian. Si Imelda had 3,000 pairs of shoes or more. She had so much jewelry. Hindi natin yan alam, di ba? Tapos ginamit nila yung eventually nagsalita yung mga cronies at saka yung mga technocrats. They said, Imelda Marcos made the government financial institutions her personal piggy bank, kumukuha lang siya ng pera doon, So things like that. Dahil dun sa EDSA, because of that was a turning point, opened the floodgates to let us know what was happening. Although may mga unti-unting before that, unti-unting reports, but talagang because of EDSA, we knew the extent of the corruption, of the thievery, and all that.
Yeah. And I think it, as you said, parang na-feed talaga that hunger for information that was parang siguro repressed for so long. Siguro.
Yeah, so I joined the GMA Channel 7 not long after that. And patok na patok noon yung mga talk shows. Can you imagine yung mga talk shows on prime time? So you had Dong Puno, siguro hindi mo nakilala tong mga si Dong Puno, si Perfecto Fernandez, si Melinda Quintas de Jesus, Jose Mariveles, and they were talking about politics, they were talking about social issues, and people were tuning into them kasi there was a hunger nga parang after 14 years finally
Yeah.
We're finding out what's going on and what's the background of all of these things that we are going through, 'di ba? Parang ganun yung nangyari. So, naging umusbong yung mga broadcast networks, bumalik yung ABS-CBN, tapos dumating yung ABC5, and yun, nagkaroon there was a flowering of news and information, of journalism during that time. So, masasabi natin golden age ng journalism, yung Cory Aquino years. Oo.
Definitely. So you were saying nga po talaga na, yun nga talaga, it really opened up that space for information, for questions, for people to ask questions, to get those questions answered.
Yes. At saka alam mo, si Cory, parang si Pinoy, wala silang pakialam sa press. Wala silang, kahit anong sulatin mo about them. At least that's my perception of the two presidents. They don't care. You just write. Parang, it's not like yung other officials na pag may sinulat ka, they'll call you, they'll do things, you know, they'll sue you and all that. Of course, there was one incident though where Cory got sort of medyo naging balat sibuya siya, I don't know. She felt offended when Louis Beltran, again my teacher, Louis Beltran wrote that in one of the coup attempts, nagkaroon ng maraming coup attempts during Cory Aquino's time. In one of the coup attempts, Louis Beltran wrote that Cory Aquino hid under the bed in her house in Malacanang. Ay, na-offend si Cory Aquino doon, and she filed a libel suit against Louis Beltran.
But as you mentioned, parang, well, I mean, in comparison siguro to what parang someone like Marcos would have done, di ba? Parang if may ma-publish na something like that.
Yeah.
So, well, now that we parang moving forward, and now that parang syempre we're situating ourselves in the contemporary. So earlier, di ba, you mentioned there are certain parallels between parang what happened back then with, you know, the silencing of media, with, let's say, the closing of the ABS-CBN and the parang shutting down of their franchise. What do you think are parang lessons that we can learn from the experience of journalists, media practitioners, and the, you know, people who work in media through parang what can they learn from the experience, not just during EDSA, but, you know, given our conversation from martial law itself? Parang what do you think are lessons that can be highlighted?
Ako, unang-una, I think talagang kailangan i-strengthen ang democracy. Kasi kaya yung strengthen the institutions, strengthen the rule of law, strengthen human rights. Alam mo, nakalimutan kasi natin yung human rights. Yung strengthen human rights so that what Duterte did in 2020 will not happen again. Pero ang nangyari kasi, slowly nagkaroon ng erosion ng ating mga democratic institutions, and Duterte was able to silence the media. He was able to instill fear. In 1972, they had to close down all media stations to frighten everyone. In 2020, they only had to close down one to frighten everyone. Guess what? They only had to close down the biggest, and everyone is frightened. Natakot. So, but you had a Congress that was, you know, subservient to Duterte, hindi independent. So they were able to do Duterte's bidding. I think that's one, yung strengthen institution, but that's long term. Strengthen democratic institutions. I wonder how we're going to do it now that we have another Marcos for a president, di ba? Secondly, we need to support the press. We need to support newspapers, broadcast news. We need to patronize them. we need to realize that journalists perform a special obligation, a special role. They report on what's going on and they hold officials to account. Maybe you can say, we do that naman now on social media. It's being done. But the people who do that on social media are, some of them are accidental journalists. They're not really, they don't really do it regularly or for a living. And some have other concerns. If they want to quit, they can always quit. So we have to support the media. And on the part of the media also, the media has to be more open, more transparent, and tell people how they do things para makilala ng mga tao. Ano ba talaga ang journalist, di ba? Ano ba talagang ginagawa nyo? Marami sa generation ninyo ba? hindi na masyadong nagbabasa ng dyaryo. I know you read it online, but you probably prefer to get the news from your chat groups, your relatives and friends, di ba? Organizations. But iba kasi yung kumuha ka ng information sa dyaryo. Alam mo na inedit ito, alam mo na kinuha lahat ng, that's what we know, kinuha lahat ng sides, pumunta sa actual scene of the crime or scene of the disaster yung mga reporters, hindi lang nakaupo sila sa harap ng computer. So there's an effort. So yun, kailangan din ng media na pakilalang sarili or mapalapit sa mga tao.
Salamat po for those. Well, at least 3 points nga po na especially on parang from a long-term, more institutional perspective, from the perspective of the media, and of course the perspective of parang us. Kami as parang the receivers of information. I'd like to parang maybe zoom in on the first point that you raised regarding the importance of the media and parang how that's also tied to nurturing parang democratic spaces and why strengthening democratic institutions can help parang support media. So maybe we can talk about that more. Why do you think parang journalism and let's say press freedom, why is that important to democracy as a whole?
So press freedom and democracy are supposed to go hand in hand. One of the hallmarks of a true democracy is the exercise of rights and freedoms, no? Freedom of expression, freedom of the press. Without these rights, hindi mo talaga masasabi na nasa demokrasya ka, nasa true functioning democracy ka. So, for example, right now, people probably have the impression that we are in a democracy kasi we can say anything on social media. But can you really say anything can you really report freely on social media? So to be a democracy, you need a free press, no? That reports news and information with that will help citizens make informed decisions, especially when choosing leaders during election time. Tapos yung role ng journalist is to act as watchdog, no? Report kung ano yung ginagawa ng mga government officials, kung paano ba ginagastos yung pera natin, gano'n.
I see. Yeah. And I think that's where parang your point po regarding parang the specific role of parang journalists comes into play, or at least the specific role of the media comes into play versus let's say social media. Nung nabanggit nyo nga po yun, naisip ko ngayon na, di ba there are some people nga who say, ba't pa natin nga kailangan ng media when we have parang social media, we have parang different sources of information like yung mga vloggers or YouTube, parang very on the ground ang kanilang approach, but you mentioned nga na parang medyo optional kasi siya or accidental na at any moment you can say na ay ayoko na tong gawin. So with media, parang with your training, let's say as media practitioners and journalists, may specific discipline that comes into that. And parang
so there's a profession. I mean, it's a professional way of reporting things, di ba? And there are standards that we have to observe, no? That fairness, balance, and all that. And our editors check our articles. So there's a process in the newsroom where you confer with your editors and decide what is news and what is not news, di ba? What is important and what is not important. So sa ngayon, hindi parang natakot kasi yung press eh. There are lots of things that are not reported.
Yeah.
Lots of things going on that are not reported. Tapos just to add to what press freedom is, UNESCO has been saying that there's 3 elements to press freedom. One is media freedom, one is media pluralism, and one is independence. So it's not enough that you're free to write what you want to write or what needs to be written. It's also important that many voices are out there reporting. So you can't just have one kind of news organization reporting the news, like a news organization that's pro certain types of people, no? Kailangan mo ng maraming voices eh. You need the voices of everyone and anyone in society should be able to participate, no? Tapos yung third is independence. Yung dapat magagawa mo yung ginagawa mo without pressure from politicians or commercial interests, So yung press freedom, may mga elemento siya eh. Hindi lang yung mai-report mo ang dapat i-report, kundi ipasok mo pa yung mga ibang voices. Kasi halimbawa, nung nawala yung ABS-CBN, yung ABS-CBN kasi may mga local radio stations yan, madami. So, nawala yung mga voices ng mga Pilipino na gumagamit ng airwaves dun sa malalayang lugar na abot ng radyo. Nawala yun. Diba? So, ayun.
Salamat po for, I think your last point, especially regarding parang how the freedom of the press is not parang simply being free to do so, but there are many aspects to it. Maybe I think we can, maybe my last question would really be, how can we as recipients or us who are not journalists or media practitioners or media professionals, how can we continue to support this freedom of the press, especially since nabanggit nyo nga na parang ngayon may takot na talaga and that there are many things that go unreported?
Well, there are many kinds of media organizations you'll probably see in your news feed, diba? I guess sa news feed mo na lang makikita. So you have the big ones, the mainstream, you have the Inquirers of this world, Inquirer, Philippine Star, ABS-CBN, the big ones. But there are also many other small ones. There are also commercial stations and commercial entities. There are also non-profits. So we must be open. We must open our attention spans to all of these entities. So click on stories that are written by journalists and published by the mainstream news media, but also read the community press, read the nonprofits like the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, Vera Files, Minda News, madami yan eh. So, yung mga maliliit na yan, since I worked for PCIJ and Vera Files, I know that the life of a nonprofit can be very unstable and unsure, but they're doing good work. Yung hindi nagagawa ng mainstream, nagagawa ng nonprofits. So in our experience, we've done a lot of work investigating presidents, di ba? We investigated presidents. In PCIJ, we investigated Joseph Estrada, di ba? And then in Vera Files, we investigated Mikey Arroyo and how he bought houses in the US using pala campaign money. Di ba yung mga ganon na... These are things that need to be written para alam natin yung ginagawa ng mga officials natin and our institutions. And when we read those kinds of things, we encourage them to write, and we also show everyone that there's an audience for this and people want these kinds of stories.
Yeah. Salamat po for that, ma'am. Grabe, I mean, I think I learned so much listening to you, and I'm sure our audience did. Before I synthesize, meron pong greeting po for you. May nag-message po to give their greetings si Jean Mangaluz, former intern at
Oh, hi, Jean.
Radyo po.
Yeah.
Meron pong nag-shout out.
Nasa Inquirer na yata si Jean eh.
Okay. Well, hello po. Salamat po sa papanood sa Baka Naman Pwede. So before we go, let me try to synthesize our very interesting and very colorful discussion. So I think we really highlighted that, we cannot talk about EDSA without highlighting the hunger for information. Without talking about the repression and the age of silencing during the Marcos years, and how there was people kind of accepted it, but the emergence of yung mosquito press kind of fed that hunger for information that was being repressed. And of course, we pay a lot of homage to this mosquito press, the mosquito papers, as you mentioned, such as We Forum, Pahayagang Malaya, and the women writers that you mentioned, that really helped parang usher in, or at least inspire that continued courage. I think you also highlighted parang how interestingly education for journalists, or education for those interested in journalism, also highlighted independent writing. And all of this came to a head during the 1986 EDSA revolution, which I think, based on our conversation, is just one piece in parang ushering that golden age of media, which the post EDSA led to the emergence of many presses, many talk shows, many forms of media like TV, radio, etc. Which kind of bring us to the present now, and we talk about parang why it is still continuously important to nurture our media, and why that is parallel to nurturing our democracy, highlighting the specific role of media versus social media, despite what certain administrations or certain bodies may seem to think. There's a specific discipline in media, there's a specific profession to it, as you have mentioned. And we close the discussion with highlighting the importance of us as recipients to support and be open to these different entities, to these different forms of media. Tangkilikin nga natin sila, yung ating mga independent press. And at the same time, a message to the people to make it closer to the people, as you said, the encouraging a diversity of voices, and parang encouraging people to share the stories that remain unshared, or talk about the questions that continuously remain unanswered. So, well, maraming salamat po, Ma'am Luz, for that conversation, for our discussion. Bago tayo umalis, baka pwede pong makahingi kami ng konting pabaon or last words for you for this afternoon. So, bilang veteran or guest na po kayo before ng Baka Naman Pwede, we'd like you to fill in the sentence, baka naman pwede, followed by your message for our listeners, especially to the youth, journalism students, everyone who may be listening about our topic today, our conversation today.
So, baka naman pwedeng patuloy nating tangkilikin ang journalism, ang media. Yung alam mo, isang nangyari nung panahon ni Duterte, sinabi niya na bias daw yung media, no? Kaya parang si Trump ganun din eh, parang pareho sila ni Trump. Ganun yung message nila sa tao na naging dahilan para magkaroon ng isang dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng loss of trust. So patuloy tayong magtangkilik sa newspapers, radyo, television. Tapos realize lang natin yung may role, may papel ang journalism sa ating lipunan na hindi talaga na gagampanan ng social media. Na mga vloggers pala at saka influencers.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Luz. At dito nagtatapos ang Baka Naman Pwede. Maraming salamat uli kay Ma'am Luz Rimban para sa pagpapaunlak sa aming imbitasyon at sa ating talakayan. Baka naman pwedeng i-like nyo rin ang Institute of Philippine Culture sa Facebook para sa iba pa naming announcements at events. Hanggang sa susunod, ako si Trixie Beato mula sa IPC. Patuloy tayong mag-ingat at laging tandaan, kung may gustong maunawaan, baka naman pwede nating pag pag-uusapan. So maraming salamat po. Ingat po sa ating lahat. Thanks, Ma'am Luz!
Bye.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede?
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon, ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede!
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo Katipunan, 87.9 FM.